Hello, and welcome to this week's Question of the Week. This week, a listener asks, what does God mean by, thy spoil shall be divided in the midst of thee? Chris goes to the Bible to answer this good question, and enjoy the discussion.
Welcome to our program. Please go ahead with your call.
Hi, Chris. Today I noticed you posted Zechariah 14:1, and when I went to look at it, I was really curious about what God means by thy spoil shall be divided in the midst of thee. Can you go over that?
Yeah, let's take a look. Zechariah 14 and verse 1. It says, Behold, the day of Jehovah cometh, and thy spoil shall be divided in the midst of thee. And the day of Jehovah is Judgment Day, and the final judgment of God starts with the churches and transitions into the day of judgment itself. So, what is this spoil being divided in the midst of thee? And it would be the great multitude. So, I think both end time judgments or both tribulations at the time of the end, there is the judgment on the church, begins there, and then transitions to the judgment on the world. Tribulation is a synonym for judgment. So when we say great tribulation, we're really saying great judgment, and the target was the church. And then when I make reference, or anyone makes reference to the world's tribulation at this time, it's the world's judgment. And we've always known this, or not always, but for quite some time, we have known of God's plan to bring about a twofold judgment, starting with the city called by his name, the corporate church, and then moving on to the world. And so the salvation of the great multitude saved out of the great tribulation period, that is the spoil. That's the spoil that identifies with Satan's house. Remember in Mark 3, where we read of a house divided, it says in verse 24, and if a kingdom be divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house be divided against itself, that house cannot stand. And if Satan rise up against himself and be divided, he cannot stand, but hath an end. No man can enter into a strong man's house and spoil his goods, except he will first bind the strong man, and then he will spoil his house. So there we have the very same ingredients that Zechariah 14:1 is using. Behold, the day of Jehovah cometh, and thy spoil shall be divided in the midst of thee. And this would point to the house of Satan. You know, we've understood this, but we've tied it to the cross solely, and Satan bound at the cross. And then we've said and understood, Mr. Camping pointed this out many times. Well, once Christ goes to the cross, or a little bit thereafter, then Peter preaches one sermon, 3,000 are saved. He would then emphasize this is because Satan is bound. He's bound. It's a figurative binding, a spiritual binding of some sort. But the connections made between the salvation of the 3,000 and Christ's work on the cross, his atoning work, and actually we know it was a work of demonstration now at this time. And yet some questions have come up. Some questions have arisen, about that understanding. If it required Satan to be bound in order for many to be saved, why were there a great number saved in Nineveh in the Old Testament when Satan was loosed? He was not bound. And yet there were quite a number. The salvation of the men of Nineveh, we would say, is the great multitude of the Old Testament. You will not find a greater number saved at one time anywhere in all the Old Testament. And also, here's something very curious. If it was necessary to bind Satan at the cross, if it was necessary in order to have this, great salvation, which really doesn't make sense. Why could you have little salvation prior to that? There were 500 in Acts 1. So there were some saved over the period, of the time of Jesus, some of the apostles as well. Why could there be little salvation? If it was necessary to bind Satan, then why wouldn't that apply to all people? Nobody could be saved until he's bound. So there's some very, curious things about this, especially when we think of the time of the end, when Satan is loosed. He's loosed. And well, given the previous understanding, he needed to be bound in order for those 3,000 to be saved. Then we would think once he's loosed, well, then it's going to be hardly anyone who will be saved. And yet it was actually the opposite. God saved the best for last. He saved the great multitude during the Great Tribulation, the second part, at a time when Satan was loosed. He was loosed out of his prison. So very, very, thought-provoking things that we didn't think about earlier. And we have to come to the conclusion that God can save his people at any time, regardless of Satan's spiritual condition. He could save the Ninevites, Satan's loose. He could save a great multitude, Satan's loose, or he could save all those during the church age, Satan's bound. God is sovereign. God is sovereign. And so just looking at that, we do not necessarily have to think that he had to be bound at the cross. And even we have some questions about that, because the actual work of Christ, the atonement, was performed at the foundation of the world, which is really the reason why God could save anyone at any time throughout earth history, because he had already done that work. It was really our understanding of the binding of Satan and on the day of Pentecost and the 3,000 being saved was really a leftover understanding related to the whole doctrine of Jesus paying for sins at the cross. And there was no payment for sin at the cross. So it just opens things wide up so we can look at the binding of Satan and the spoiling of his house with new eyes, and we can consider why here a house divided, kingdom divided, Satan divided, and the house falls and Satan has an end and so forth. And we can see, and we've learned how that ties into Judgment Day. Judgment Day. And that is really the fall of Satan. His house is wide open to the Lord God. It says in Revelation 18 concerning Babylon, strong is the Lord God that judgeth her. How's it put here in Mark 3? No man can enter into a strong man's house and spoil his goods, except he will first bind the strong man, and then he will spoil his house. And I think in another account it says, a stronger than he. Well, strong is the Lord God that judgeth Babylon, and that's the house of Satan. And now in the day of judgment will be that spoil.
Thanks for watching. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notifications. That way you don't miss any upcoming videos.